Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of CoPilot Lead Speak, the series where we talk to experts from both within Microsoft and around the industry about AI security. I'm Sarah Young, and today I have another Sarah joining me. Sarah, welcome.
Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
So, Sarah, before we jump into things, can you tell us who you are and what you do at Microsoft?
um, are those different things, I guess?
No, they're not. It's all the same. It's all the same.
So I'm Sarah Bird. I lead responsible AI engineering at Microsoft, which probably sounds kind of like a vague thing. So maybe to make that a bit clearer, my team is responsible for taking new AI technologies like GPT-4 and ensuring that we are developing them responsibly. So in that case, we work with OpenAI for GPT-4, and then ensuring that we are figuring out how to use them responsibly. So my team led the development of GPT-4 integrated in the search engine, which is now Microsoft CoPilot, and figuring out how to do that responsibly. And so we brought in experts from around the company, figured out what were the risks with the technology, and then build solutions to mitigate those. We take those solutions and use them as technology to power all of our AI at Microsoft, and something that our customers can also use.
Yeah. Now, come from a security background, and I know we just briefly talked about this before we started recording, but when I first heard the term responsible I was like, okay, that's interesting, but what does it have to do with security? Because of course, in my mind, when I was not in the know, they were very different things. But what I've learned since is that security and responsible AI are really very closely tied together with this new technology. What it, could you maybe explain a little bit more there?
Yeah, it's a great question. So actually, we use responsible AI as kind of our big tent. So security is one of our responsible AI principles, along with privacy, fairness, and inclusiveness, safety and reliability, transparency and accountability. But we know in practice, like security is a discipline that's been around a lot longer than responsible AI, and so there's a lot that's already mature in security that actually we can just build on top of and almost can take for granted in responsible AI. But the real challenge here is about the new types of risk that AI technologies bring. And so, for example, with generative AI, you can see challenges around prompt injection attacks, which are changing the behavior of the AI system by confusing it with data that comes in or how the user responds to the system. And so that's a new type of security attack. It looks exactly like sort of inverting control, but the techniques that they're using to do that are AI techniques. And so you could use some of the same techniques to get it to produce harmful content or to get it to exfiltrate data. And so you end up with this very blurry line that is really saying, okay, we have to enable this AI system to behave the way we want it to behave, which some of that can feel like the responsible AI part, and also not be vulnerable to different types of attacks that result in it behaving how we don't want it to behave. And then that feels very much like the security part. And so how we actually practice this at Microsoft is deep collaboration between our AI expertise, our sort of areas like responsible AI, like fairness, all the way to our security expertise to figure out how do we secure our AI systems against traditional attacks and these new types of attacks, and ensure that we can use the security techniques to also prevent these new types of responsible AI risk as well.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very interesting how I think we're going to have almost a brand new set of expertise, right? Responsible AI professionals, but also our security folks are going to have to upskill themselves to understand that more because I know that's what I've been doing maybe the past year or so now.
Yeah, a great example of this is our AI red team. And AI red team is a red team that we built, of course, based on all of the security red teaming best practices. And they go in and red team our AI systems, as their name would suggest, but they actually have to red team for, a large variety of risks. So not just sort of what we think of the traditional security attacks and this traditional security risk, but also things that are changing the behavior of the AI system. For example, getting it to produce, harmful content, getting it to behave in a way that would be, harmful to the enterprise, all of that. And so they are using their security techniques, but they have to look for a much wider aperture of the types of risks they're trying to probe the system for. And so we started with red teaming experts, but they had to be trained on a much bigger variety of risk. And there's a lot of expertise that comes in that as well. And so we're kind of seeing that across the board, even with things like incident response or threat intelligence. We want to go out there and understand who is trying to use our AI systems to do things that we think are, a risk to Microsoft, a risk to society, a risk to our customers. And that risk aperture can just be much bigger now, thanks to AI and the type of risk we're looking for.
Mm. It's yeah, definitely. We're actually going to in this series talk to some of the red teamers in a couple of episodes time, and it's very interesting their jobs. I'm quite jealous actually. I think what they do is very, very interesting. So we've talked about probably, yeah, the potential things that the attacks and things that can go wrong, or the way that folks can manipulate AI systems. But what do you think is the most exciting thing in your opinion? The thing that you find the most exciting, or that you're most hopeful about with this age of AI and all the good things that we can do?
Yeah, maybe let me give a more general answer and then tell you a little bit about something that's, closer to my everyday work. I think the potential of this technology is just sort of enormous, but also quite unique compared to some other technologies in the past. Because it speaks human language, it is actually can be a bridge to all other technologies. And so we see this amazing opportunity to empower people to interact with other technologies, to interact with complex systems, but in their own language without having to understand the jargon. And so it really enables technology to meet you where you're at, rather than you having to go and figure out how to meet technology where it's at. And so I think, that's the thing that we see as like the future that's at stake with this technology, and I think is so amazing. Now, in my day-to-day work, one of the challenges we had is a lot of these different types of risks we're talking about. Like, for example, the system producing like stereotyping content that you don't want to be added, more and more of that added into the world just accidentally. That is something that was very hard to measure for, like to measure whether a conversation was appropriate by some, definition of that. We actually had to work with like expert linguist. We can't even use like crowd labeling to really score that effectively. And what we discovered actually with GPT-4 was it was the first technology that we're actually able to get it to annotate almost at that expert human level, which meant we could actually automate the scoring of these different types of responsible AI risk. And so if anyone works in sort of metrics and that, that if you have much tighter metrics, that enables you to innovate much faster, right? Because you can reduce your iteration cycle. So we went from, okay, maybe we could get a responsible AI score, once a month, to every day we can just rerun all the tests, change our mitigation, see what's really worked. And so it just totally exploded what was possible. And so that's to say that this technology is actually so powerful as a responsible AI tool or as a safety tool. And obviously we've seen that with security CoPilot as well. And so, for my day-to-day, I'm also excited about how great this technology is for us to go solve these types of problems. And so I think that's one of the things that's been really exciting about, the last 2 years, is just all of a sudden unblocking all of these things that we thought were like really hard in our jobs, or we thought weren't possible, and suddenly being able to just do so much more with AI.
Yeah, I think for Copilot for security specifically, we throw out the phrase democratizing security for everybody. But I think the thing I'm most excited about is that using AI tools to help people do security, because of course we've always had a shortage of security professionals, and isn't going to fix that, but I think it will help at least plug some gaps, which is great because
And
we can't create enough security professionals, sadly, right? Not quickly.
yeah, and in lowering the barrier to entry, right?
Mhm.
Because, and this is what I was saying about the technology meeting you where you're at, right? You might actually have a lot of the right potential skills, but maybe just not the formal training with all the jargon and everything, and the technology can kind of help smooth over some of that transition. Or, actually, we have. I actually know women in security who've said, they first moved into the field. It felt like they were nervous to ask, like, what does this mean or what is that? And now you have a technology that can actually like help make all of that easier for you. And so you can skill up a lot faster if you have that kind of, co-pilot support in your learning, right?
Yeah, I think as well, the other big plus that I see or foresee is that small businesses who may not have a dedicated security person, it might be a system admin or someone like that who just does it on the side because it's a small organization that doesn't have that kind of headcount. It's going to really help folks like that as well because they don't have a formal security team. So I think that's going to be an interesting one too.
Yeah, I think that's a really important one as well. And then we know, of course, the adversaries are getting more and more sophisticated. And so you have to have the most sophisticated technology behind you, supporting you in defending against that. Otherwise, it's going to be, an unfair fight, right? And so that's really why we see it as so important to innovate with this technology and really make sure that we're, making our products safe and secure, but also making it easier for everybody to do safety and security. I know in the space that I work in, focused on this like AI safety, we know that we have so much more expertise in Microsoft than most of the world, and we don't even have enough. And so we really look at how can we take all of that expertise and turn it into technology and tools such that everyone gets the benefit of the expertise, but everyone doesn't have to pay that cost themselves, right? Because that's really going to limit, how much like AI we can actually build in the world if it's that hard, right? And so our job is exactly to lower the barrier of entry to make it really easy to make AI systems safe and secure, and then of course use AI also to make other systems safe and secure.
Mm. So when we've talked about responsible AI, Sarah, obviously we've moved from principles because we have those pillars, as you already
Yeah.
mentioned, but we're moving it to actionable practices. And could you talk a little bit more about what we've done there and what your teams are doing?
Yeah, that's been actually, I think one of the most exciting journeys, which is, we thought starting now, I think 7 or 8 years ago, sat down and said, like, what should our principles be as a company? And that was actually, reasonably easy to write down, right? You could maybe change some words or things, but like, we like, AI has to work for everyone. It has to be, fair and secure and all of these things. And so that part was easy in a sense. But then turning those into practice is where the journey has been, because the practice is about ensuring both you know how to solve a particular problem, like how do we test a system for fairness, or how do we actually make this particular part secure, but then you also then need to build that into the engineering like tools and lifestyle and culture, right? And so I mentioned that my team, one of our roles is to go figure out how to, so we go first in solving a lot of these challenges and then figure out how we can scale that solution. And scale that solution could be a best practice where we're training everyone, and that's one way. But obviously, the easiest way to do this is through tools, right? If we have a tool that encapsulates that best practice, then that's a lot easier. And so, to do this, we basically partner with Microsoft Research and partner with our Office of Responsible AI, and then in any dedicated experts we need anywhere. So, for example, we work on, one of the new risks with generative AI is potentially producing copyright materials. And so there we brought in experts specifically on IP and copyright to actually help us red team the systems, but also help us understand the different types of risk. So we bring in all these different types of experts. And with that, then we figure out and say, okay, how do we define this specific risk? Now, how do we test for that specific risk? then how do we go mitigate that specific risk, and then how do we monitor for that risk, actually in production. And so for each of those stages, we turn that into actually like a measurement tool to measure the risk, and mitigation technology to actually go mitigate it, then of course monitoring technology. And so that's kind of the journey that we go on with each particular risk, and that's I think really, really exciting. But like, the technology is broad, and so one day we're working on, even just in generative AI, one day we're working on like hallucination, and then the next day we're looking at like prompt injection attacks, and then copyright. And so one of the interesting challenges here is just also turning those into repeatable practices that we can build on, so that each new risk type, we're not starting from scratch. And so the way we manage that is to find some of the same techniques to solve the problems. Like, what can we fix with a meta prompt? What can we fix with like, real-time AI classification? What do we fix with alignment at the core model? But that's really been I think, the really interesting part of this journey.
Now, I'm going to jump on one of the things you mentioned there, Sarah, which was the meta prompt. Now, I only recently, maybe the last few months, probably got my head around what the meta prompt is and why it's actually, I would say, very important for security folks in particular to understand what it is and how you use it. And I know we've released some templates to help folks with this because it's a relatively new concept, right? But could you, for anyone who's tuning in who's uninitiated, would you be able to tell us a little bit more about exactly what the meta prompt is and why security folks should care?
Yeah, the meta prompt, also called the system prompt sometimes, is frankly, it's just the program that we send to the model, right? So like, people are often thinking just about the prompt they type in. If you use something like, Microsoft CoPilot or ChatGPT, you think about the part you sent, what the user sent. But we actually encapsulate that in a whole system instruction saying, hey, the thing we want you to do is be CoPilot that looks up stuff on the search engine and responds in a way that's appropriate, and here's what the users asked for, so now go do and figure it out, right? And so it's just a program, but the thing that's so funny about this is it's a program in natural language, so it feels very, very different to program this way, because you're sending this program instructions, but just as sentences. And then folks that have been very deep in prompt engineering have learned that it doesn't necessarily behave the way you would expect a human to behave. And so small changes in phrasing can sort of greatly change the outcome of this. And so in a way that it greatly changed the outcome in the way that could matter very much. So I'll give an example from the sort of the safety side of the house, which is about not producing copyright materials. And we found in our adversarial testing that if we, as part of the meta prompt instruction, said, if the user has asked for copyright materials such as songs or books or anything like that, then do not produce those results. And in our adversarial testing, when we use that phrasing, it was still failing 43% of the time. But if we phrased it differently and said, if the user asks for song lyrics, etc., activate a safe mode that only summarizes results, then it was actually failing in our adversarial testing less than 1% of the time. So like, rewriting the sentence in a slightly different way resulted in like a much more robust system. And now you don't want to rely only on the meta prompt, but it is a significant part of sort of helping the model get it right in most cases and providing more robust defenses. And so we absolutely find that people don't understand how powerful that meta prompt can be to mitigate all of these different types of risk, or just really drive the system to behave how you want it to. And so that's why exactly we're releasing prompt templates and educating on this, because there's so much power in that. And it's a new programming language, so most people don't know how to use it yet.
Yeah, well, like we were saying before, some of these things are just entirely new skill sets, right? In terms of, yeah, it's natural language programming. I've been really surprised at, like you said, but just by tweaking the phrasing, how different the results can be.
Yes, and it was a funny. We were some of the first people when we were developing with GPT-4, really pushing the boundary on what could be done in this prompt engineering, because we were trying to mitigate all of the different, risks we saw possible with the technology. And it's maddening because it, responds in a human way. And you're like, why won't you do what I say, right? It feels like a little bit like working with a toddler. But then also wonderful when you're like, I have an idea for a synonym, and then the synonym actually like solves the problem, right? So it is both kind of a joyful and frustrating activity to be discovering all of this. And now people put out, all sorts of prompt engineering guides. A lot of the best practices are well known, so you can go and learn from all of that. But there is also some joy in just experimenting with it, because it is a new technology interface, and it's like fun to kind of see how it works.
Yeah, like you said, it's fascinating how just changing, the word. I feel like we're all going to become much better at our vocabulary when you doing prompt engineering, to be honest with you, because we're all going to learn, like you said, different synonyms for the same thing to help our models. But that leads me on very nicely to the next question I was going to ask you, which was, um, like we said, this is a whole new skill set. And D&I, diversity and inclusion, is obviously very important in responsible AI. So, what are we doing in Microsoft? Could you talk a little bit about what we do internally to make sure that we have diverse perspectives in AI, and our deployment and the products that we build?
Yeah, there's a couple different ways we look at this from responsible AI. Of course, Microsoft works to ensure that we are, bringing in a diverse set of employees overall, and and that matters because everyone has innovation stories where if there was someone in the room who thought slightly differently, they're like, "What about this thing?" Right? And that changes the trajectory. But the important thing is actually we don't want to rely on that alone, because there's no way we'll hire people that like represent every group on the planet and they will all be working exactly on the project. But also, like, people are individuals, and so what does it even mean in some ways to represent these different groups? And so one of the things we also do is work with experts who are actually specific experts in the different types of diversity. So, for example, we had a challenge a couple years ago where our speech to text model was showing differences in performance for language varieties spoken in some Black and African American communities. And so we worked with a professor from the University of Washington who was an expert in that linguistic variation in those language varieties. And she helped us actually understand what are all the dimensions we need to test for, so that we actually understand how to make our system robust against that different types of linguistic variation. And then she also helped us understand, obviously, the history and the evolution of that, and supported us then in being able to like go into different communities around the country and actually collect the appropriate data to really do that testing. And so we've done similar things with like experts in facial morphology, so that we understand like the diversity of how faces can be represented, and then make sure our AI system can really work well with that full spectrum of diversity. And so we also look very much to make sure we're taking a principled approach to understand actually the whole space that we need to cover for that technology, so that the technology hopefully works well out of the box for all of these different groups of people.
Hmm. And you also said that, well, part of the joy, but probably the frustration as well, is with AI, is that it doesn't always give you the response that you expect every single time. But in Microsoft and your teams, obviously, you will sort of help determine when things are ready to go out to the rest of the world and go to market. So how do we actually decide when something's ready? Being that it's not as consistent in the same way as maybe a traditional programmed product would be.
Yeah. One thing we do is, well, so first of all, we kind of start from first principles, and we say, with what this technology or this particular like AI feature is trying to achieve, which risks are potentially in scope. And so we look at the particular risk. Then we say, are the mitigations for those risks that they've deployed, are they lined up with the state of the art best practices? And then, of course, it's not enough just to say like, okay, looks like they're doing the thing that everyone else does. Okay, that's good enough. Like we actually need to test it. And so I mentioned earlier that actually GPT-4 helped unblock more testing at scale for us. That's something that we've leaned on very heavily. And so we've built a testing system where then we can actually just proactively go at our system and test all of these different types of risk and actually get out a defect rate and say, okay, I mentioned the adversarial testing, 43% versus 1%. That comes from that automated testing that we're using. And so we look and see how vulnerable is the system to our different jailbreak attacks, how vulnerable is the system to like making a mistake when it's talking about a sensitive topic. And so we basically use an automated testing that is designed to exercise these different risks. It actually role plays being a user, so it can do multi-turn things like have a longer form jailbreak conversation, and then we run those attacks at scale, so we can get out a score and say it seems about 98% of the time the system responds appropriately, and about 2% of the time the attack works or something. So we look at those scores. To calibrate. And then if we're shipping something sufficiently novel or high risk, we don't just want to rely on the automated testing. So we add that AI red teaming that I mentioned earlier. So then we have experts adversarially, testing and probing and going further. And we look at like what are the worst things they can find, what are the particular types of vulnerabilities they can find. And then all of that goes to a board of experts that says, okay, knowing what risks are possible, looking at the testing and red teaming results and the mitigations, do we feel that this is is meeting our bar as Microsoft?
Yeah, it's I think I think it's pretty intense, right? It's actually probably got more layers of testing than traditional things.
It's certainly different, right? I think we have so much maturity in testing like performance and reliability and security, and this is a new space, and so it's testing quite a variety of different things. But it feels like a lot because we're building up that muscle. But over time, it'll be like, yeah, of course you run like tests for these hundreds of different types of risk, right? And it'll probably feel normal.
Yeah, it's just everything's too bit new at the moment.
Yeah,
We'll get
definitely.
used to it. And then last but not least, I just wanted to ask you, where does responsible AI go from here? Can what's the vision going forward? Because of course this is a rapidly changing field, and the pace of adoption and innovation is mind blowing. So in terms of responsible AI, where do you see things going next?
Yeah, I think in some ways you can't separate the question completely from where's AI going. So,
Yeah.
my answers will be things like, well, multimodal and bigger models and all of that. But, I think in a more sort of abstract sense, what I think our mission is right now is we want to take this great AI technology and make it really easy for people to control and get the outcomes that they want and trust it, right? Because that's what's going to enable it to us to use it in some of the most important applications in the world, right? Being able to use this for medicine, for example, right? And so what I mentioned about the meta prompt being kind of, unexpected or like weak steering, right? That we're still getting our hands on. We have to get much better tools so that it's really easy for me, either as the AI application developer or me as the end user, to specify what I want and get the AI system to actually do that effectively with the appropriate amount of fidelity and consistency and all of that. And so I think we've got a lot more innovation to really get the systems to have that level of control built into them, and that's a lot of also like interface innovation. I don't know how to specify all the things that I want. I know I sort of know when I get an answer back that it wasn't what I wanted, but I don't necessarily know how to specify that in a great way. And so some of it's going to be figuring out how to really design these interfaces so they're powerful and efficient and effective. So I think that is one really big dimension. And then of course you've got to make sure they're adversarially robust, right? We want them to do the things we want them to do. We don't want people to be able to take advantage of them so that they can get them to do what they wanted to do, right? And so we have to look at that side as well. And then I think maybe the last interesting thing that's really happening this year that's new for responsible AI is this is the year of AI regulations coming. And so, a big place that we're engaged is figuring out how do we, as a society, govern this technology. It's important that we have, many different voices from governments, civil society, technology, in that conversation, figuring out how to effectively govern this technology globally. And so that's a place we're very much engaged in, is really a new and interesting frontier. And as technologists, we have, like I feel I have a huge role to play in showing how. Like we talked about earlier, that it was hard for us to implement policy till we knew how to go do that in practice. And then that helped make our policy better. And so the same thing, we have to innovate to show how we might solve some of the challenges, so that then the regulations have a chance to actually, effectively regulate, understanding what actually works.
Well, Sarah, I could definitely, I've said this to actually every guest in the series, but it's true. I'm sure I could talk to you all day, but you're a very busy person and have other things that you need to do. So I think we'll wrap it up there. Thanks so much for taking the time. And always feel free to come back and chat again.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This has been great. And, it's a topic I love, so I'm happy to talk about it anytime.
And to all of those of you who are tuning in at home, thank you so much for watching. Stay tuned for another episode of CoPilot Lead Speak. We've got lots of very interesting guests coming up where you can learn even more about AI security. I'm Sarah Young. Thanks for joining us, and take care.